We believe and have always believed in this country that man was created in the image of God, that he was given talents and responsibilities and was instructed to use them to make this world a better place in which to live. And you see, this is the really great thing of America.
It's time to discover what binds us together, and finding it has the power to transform our world. That's what I believe. How about you? Well, hi everyone, I'm Doug DeVos, and welcome to Believe. You know, it's always so fun to have a chance to do these episodes and to be able to talk to some very, very special people and to talk about some important topics. So today we're talking about America, and is it living up to its promise? And what about, and how do we understand or think about, what do we believe about America's journey to justice? What have we learned so far, and what do we need to think about as we go forward? And so today I'm just thrilled to join with a friend of mine, Dr. Buster Soaries, who is an expert in this area, has lived it his whole life. Buster, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being part of this. It's so great to see you again. All's well with you?
All is well, and I'd be remiss if I didn't start by just thanking you and thanking God and thanking your family for Rich DeVos. In the mid 80s, when I was committed to being a full-time youth evangelist, a company called Gospel Films came along and helped me distribute my message much more broadly than I could by foot. And your dad was the critical support for Billy Zioli and that whole team. And the DeVos family from then up to and including my current work has been a partner in my ministry, and I thank God for you.
Well, we thank God for you too, and we're blessed to have that relationship and that connection, because your message and your work is incredibly impactful. And that's what we want to spend a little time unpacking, because you have a tremendous insight, understanding, and perspective on issues that impact our lives, that build community, that build relationships, and have seen and experienced things that have done the opposite, that have, removed relationships or taken us away from people working together. So first of all, just tell us a little bit more about you. Let's talk about you. We were talking earlier about your mom and your family. So tell us a little bit about you and how you kind of started into your work in the civil rights but even before that, start just about you and your family.
Sure. Well, I grew up in a suburb of New York, Montclair, New Jersey, suburban town. It was a diverse town. About a quarter of the town was Black, and we had a little enclave in the southern end of town. My family had moved there because my grandmother worked for a wealthy family in Virginia. And when that family migrated from Virginia to New Jersey, they brought their domestic help with them, with my grandmother being one. And so my mother grew up in Montclair. My dad grew up in Brooklyn, New York. And when they got married, they decided that it would be best for the family in the future to live in New Jersey. And so as a very young child, I moved to New Jersey with my family, of course, and was raised in New Jersey, went to public schools, all of my K through 12 career, had a wonderful elementary education, went to a segregated school, was all Black. The schools there were determined by the housing patterns. And of course, since the southern end of town was all African American, we went to an African American school. But it was a fine education. We didn't realize anything about injustice. We played sports. We went to the park. It was a well-kept town. All of my neighbors owned their own homes, or they like we did. We lived in our grandmother's house. There was no divorce. Not one of my friends was raised by a single parent. The families were all intact. I lived down the street from my best friend, Joe Evans. And the rule was if I wasn't in the house by the time the street light came on, I had to be at Joe Evans' house. And so we had that kind of real close-knit community that I considered normal. I didn't realize until I was an adult that many people, and now most people, don't live that way. But I went on to high school, and in my high school, I was an athlete, but I also became an activist. I was a junior in high school when Martin Luther King was killed. And it was his death that impacted my grandmother to the extent that her response impacted me. I really, being a child of the North, being in the suburbs, I really didn't know much about civil rights. I knew a little bit about the global injustices. I knew a little bit about the enslavement of Africans, but my focus in high school, Doug, was basketball and girls.
Sounds like a good focus for a lot of us, right?
That was a great focus. And when Dr. King was killed, it broadened my perspective. Yeah. My dad was a part-time pastor and a full-time school teacher. My mom was a corporate secretary. And so my junior year in high school, when Dr. King was killed, began a process of my wanting to do more than just chase girls and play basketball. I became a student leader in high school, student activist in college. I went on to work for Jesse Jackson when, after Dr. King was killed, Jesse Jackson formed his own organization. And I was very, very excited about civil rights work. I was raised in the church, but I didn't have a personal relationship with Christ. And I got a little disenchanted with the church because I thought it was a little too stuffy, a little too legalistic. And it was, in fact, my relationship with civil rights that took me back to church. But it took me back to church more for strategic purposes than for spiritual purposes. And right at the peak of my civil rights career, I was 24 years old. I was the national director of Operation Push, reporting every day to Reverend Jackson, who was widely perceived as the successor to Martin Luther King. My dad died at 47 years old. He died as a result of having tests that required anesthesia, and the anesthesiologist gave him more than his heart could handle, and he died from an anesthesia-induced heart attack. And that night, I realized when I was writing my dad's obituary that he was actually in a better place than I was, because in the obituary, I knew enough about my dad to say that we shouldn't really worry about him because he was living forever in heaven with Christ. And I was going to church, and I was an activist. I was, as it were, leading a social movement that had a spiritual ring to it. But it was my dad's death that really was the catalyst to put me on my knees and tell God that I wanted a relationship with him the way my dad had. And that's when I became a Christian.
Wow. Wow, what a powerful story, and what an impact in your life to be able to make that transition. And thank you for sharing that as you talk about your perspective and kind of finding your way forward. Talk about a little bit. You mentioned your grandmother was highly impacted by Dr. King's assassination. Tell me a little bit more about her and why it was so impactful on her and how that translated to you.
I was very close to both of my grandmothers, my maternal and paternal grandmother. This was my mother's mother. We lived in her home. And on the day that Dr. King was killed, I went to her house to get some sweet potato pie. She was famous for her sweet potato pie. And when I got to the house, she was sitting at the dining room table with tears in her eyes. And I'd never seen her cry before. My grandmother had buried two of her adult children, but she was so strong, almost stoic-like. I'd never seen her cry. So you can be sure it got my attention. And when I asked her why she was sitting at the dining room table with tears in her eyes, she said, "They shot Dr. King today." And this was startling to me, Doug, because my grandmother was a church mother, meaning she had real high rank in a Pentecostal church. She really did not believe in protest. She would never, ever march in a demonstration. She would never go to jail. My grandmother's philosophy and theology was that God would take care of any injustice, to go along, to get along, and in her words specifically, that we shouldn't be stirring up a fuss. So wow. It was counterintuitive for me to watch my grandmother, who was literally a non-activist, almost an anti-activist, be so moved by this activist Baptist minister who lived 1,000 miles away. But it deepened my appreciation for the fact that even people like my grandmother knew that God was going to usher in a new season in this country, and that the civil rights that her parents didn't have and that she didn't have would be achieved. And thus she appreciated the value of the civil rights movement, and she also appreciated the value of Martin Luther King Jr. And I grew to understand more because I decided that any man whose life could impact my grandmother's life that significantly was a life that I needed to understand so that my life could impact someone's life in similar fashion. And so that was a very moving moment for me because I knew my grandmother's personality, and she'd never march and go to jail like the activists of the South.
Wow. Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that as well. That's, again, a very powerful perspective of how you began thinking about these topics. So tell us a little bit more at that stage, when you start to think about, matching what you experienced at that stage of your life, where we are today, kind of bringing those together as a country. We seem to be, tearing ourselves apart for so many reasons, and certainly civil rights and relationships between African Americans and others in our country. Those relationships seem just so strained. So help us understand. How should we think about justice as a country? And does America have the foundations in place to actually achieve it? We have certainly a bad past, but we've got some good things too. How should we balance that, and how should we think about it today?
Well, we have in our credo, "In God we trust." We're a country that has always acknowledged the presence and the power and the purpose of the creator of heaven and earth. We've not always agreed on God's agenda. We've not always agreed on even what to call God. We don't all worship God the same way, but there is a significant reality in both the history and the culture of our country, and that is, as a nation, unlike many other nations on the planet, we've always recognized ourselves as being subject to the divine power of a divine creator. And so, as you describe it, we have had a difficult past, but we were founded on lofty principles. We were founded on principles so lofty that they exceed the principles of the founding of any country in the history of the world. For up until the 17th century, the driving principle was one of royalty. You had to be born of a certain family and have to have blood from a certain bloodline to lead and to be qualified for significance. And what happened with not just the Magna Carta, but the founding of this country was there was a social shift that was impactful even to this day, where the people endowed by their creator were really the power base. It was the affirmation of people. It was the will of the people that would determine who was qualified to lead. And so these words, these self-evident truths that were created by God, and each individual has certain inalienable rights. You see, Doug, the only reason we can say that America has had a flawed past is because we're flawed in juxtaposition to the principles. If we had no principles, there'd be no basis for describing ourselves as having flaws. As the Bible says, if there's no law, there's no sin. And so these principles were so lofty that in many ways, the people who wrote them could not live up to them. But what they've done for our country throughout our history is give us goals and standards for which we should aspire. And that's the greatness of our country. The greatness of our country is not that we have amassed more wealth or that we have the strongest military. The greatness of our country is that we have such lofty principles that we always have something to strive for in the human experience. And that's what gives us optimism. So the civil rights movement was a movement that said, be true, America, to what you put on paper. Unfortunately, today, we often have allowed political power and the lust for power and control to really undermine the principles for which we should fight. Those principles require a sense of humility, they require a sense of accountability. And those principles, to attain the principles of the founders, it requires a sense of unity. It's we hold these truths to be self-evident. It's the United States of America. It's e pluribus unum, one out of many. And so I think we've allowed ourselves to succumb to the temptation of lusting for power as opposed to lusting for purpose.
Yeah. Wow. You said so much in that segment there. I've been trying to write down and figure out how to dive into some more areas. But this lusting for power versus the lusting for versus purpose, you know. Well, let me go back again, because sometimes a lot of the discussion today would be that America is so flawed. We haven't lived up to our purpose, but we are so flawed that we need to disregard and start over. Is that what you believe? What
no,
do you believe about?
No. What mitigates the reality of the flaws is the reality of the growth. And when you look at America's past, if you only look at the flaws, you will not recognize or even celebrate America's ability to self-correct its own flaws. We weren't invaded by foreign nations to end slavery. We did that ourselves. Now, it was bloody and it was brutal, but we did it ourselves. We didn't grant women the right to vote because the United Nations voted and demanded of us. We did that. We're a self-correcting country. We didn't fix many of the abhorrent labor conditions that often were abusive for all kinds of people, not the least of whom being children, because the world court found us guilty. America, in its structure, is a self-correcting republic, and we didn't have the military march on the White House and take over the government. There have been 40 coups d'etats in Africa in the last few years, 40, where the military just marches on their version of the White House with guns and either kills or drives the leaders out. That's not us. Every 4 years, with controversy, with difficulty, every 4 years, ultimately, we've had a smooth transfer of power in Washington. We've had a smooth transfer of power in 50 states. We have smooth transfers of power in thousands of municipalities and counties around the country. So the experiment is working. And contrary to what some of the media hype might suggest, and contrary to, again, some of the blemishes that are revealed by ongoing data, we are still the model for self-correcting democratic practices with these lofty principles. So no, there's no need to start over. The need is to have moral leadership that will stay faithful to the principles and be humble enough to recognize when we make mistakes, but to be confident enough to build on those principles.
Wow. Beautifully said. And that gives us confidence that when we make mistakes, we're not done. There is a redemption available to us as a nation. And you talked about your transition from attending church to having a relationship with Christ, and how your dad's passing had such an impact on you to think about that in a different way. Help us understand how your faith shapes your perspective on our community, on our neighborhoods, on our country. How should we think about whether we, for the audience, where they have the faith or whether they don't have a faith, or somewhere in between? How has it been for you, and how has your faith shaped what you believe?
Well, I was so inspired when I discovered that the name of your podcast was Believe It, or Believe, right? What is it? Believe? I
Right.
know it's Believe.
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 Yes.
Because our behavior flows from our beliefs. And our freedoms are dependent upon individual behavior. When I became a Christian, I guess for the purposes of this conversation, one of the key changes in my life was that I had to start by focusing on my own behavior and my own beliefs, as opposed to being an activist whose focus was exclusively on how other people treated me. Jesus said that you should be concerned if you're able to recognize the speck in someone else's eye and ignore the log in your own. And while it's
Right.
in some ways it's a nuance, but from a human perspective, we start with our own personal responsibility. You know about my work relative to finances
Yes.
and what we teach people. It's largely based on Luke chapter 15. And in Luke chapter 15, you see a young man who inherits great wealth from his dad, but he blows it. Now, if you had bumped into that guy when he was broke, you might consider him a victim of circumstances. You might assume that someone robbed him. But the narrative says that his own choices, his own behavior produced those outcomes. And so I had to take responsibility for my own behavior. And as a Christian now, not only do I have a sense of responsibility, but thank God I have a role model in Jesus. So Jesus defines for me, even more fundamentally than the American Constitution or Declaration of Independence. Jesus defines for me my behavior, because as a believer, I'm believing in Jesus. I don't believe in a particular translation of the Bible over another translation. I don't believe in a denomination over another denomination. I don't believe in a race over another race. My belief system flows from Jesus. And Jesus did and said just enough to help me shape a whole new personality. And God, my theology says that God not only gives me these Jesus principles and Jesus standards, but God provides a spiritual source of power to enable me to accomplish those things. So instead of looking at the social impact on my life, I look at the spiritual obligations that flow from my belief in Jesus.
That's spectacular. And that it's really important. Again, we're not. This isn't the forum to try to evangelize here, even though
Right.
you do it so well, no matter where you are. But you talk about, and I think the idea of living out your beliefs is to me kind of the definition of evangelism anyway. It's living out your beliefs in a way that's credible and believable. And I'm trying to I think of the what was it, St. Francis of Assisi, spread the gospel, and if necessary, use words.
Right.
So it's your behaviors. But expand a little bit more on this idea of, you were talking about what people were doing to you, and then as you transition your faith, it was about the personal responsibility of how you were behaving and what you were responsible for because of what you believed. How can that, if you not disconnect it from a faith discussion, but connect it into a neighborhood discussion, a community discussion, how can that help us think through what we can do? Because I'll watch the news and I'll complain about this and they should do that. And of course, I have all the better ideas of what somebody else should do, just like a coach on a basketball game, right? Oh, the coach should have done this. The player should have done this. I can't do anything that, that they're doing. So how should we think about focusing on ourselves as we deal with some of the issues that we're facing as a nation? And as we try to answer that question, is how are we going to live up to our promise, not as a nation, as a community?
Yeah, well, in the first instance, when looking at myself, I have to ask myself the question, what are the distinct characteristics for being human? There are many life forms. But if you look at it anthropologically, if you look at it biologically, if you look at it sociologically, but look at life theologically, you have to conclude objectively that the human species is the superior life form. We are not monkeys. We are not kangaroos. We are not dogs and cats, although they are alive too. If you shoot a monkey, it'll bleed, right?
Right.
But there's a distinct difference between the Homo sapien lifestyle. So what separates us? What separates us from those creatures? Not only do we have intellectual capacity, we write books, we have libraries, we have schools, but we also have social structures. We have interactive expectations. And so just on a human level, when we look at what does it mean to be a Homo sapien? What does it mean to be a functional creature that has all of these gifts and all of this talent? We call it the image of God, but leave theology out for a moment. What does it mean to be a person as it relates to family, as it relates to friendship, as it relates to finance, as it relates, and so what happens is if you want to look at it through the lens of justice versus injustice, the question becomes, what does a just human look like? And of course, theologically, it's easy for me as a Christian because one of the principles is treat other people the way you want to be treated.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
That's from the gospel.
Yeah.
And so if I'm reading the gospel from the perspective of trying to answer that question, what distinguishes me as a Homo sapien from all of the other life forms that God made? There are certainly similarities. The biologists will tell us that mammals have so much in common, but there's got to be some distinctiveness for our crowd, for our level of existence. And what that does, it just leads you, Doug, to some very basic common sense answers. When I talk to teenagers, and we were talking, in fact, this is one of the videos your dad helped us produce. And we were talking about sexual morality. What does a dog do? A dog impregnates another dog, and the male dog doesn't stick around to see what the little puppies look like. The male dog doesn't go to Cub Scouts with the little puppy dogs. The male dog doesn't go to back to school night. Male dogs just kind of move from female dog to female dog. And that's appropriate behavior for a dog. But if I'm a man,
yeah.
while I share some similarities in terms of, the ability to procreate, the assumption is that a male, a human, behaves in a superior fashion to a dog. So a human, is able to commit to a marital relationship, make vows and keep vows, bear children and raise the children, be a man, be a dad, go to back to school night, attend graduation. And you don't need any theology at all to understand that there must be a difference in terms of sexual morality between a man and a dog.
Right.
So you can take that to any area of life you want to. But I believe that I'm a Christian because I believe Christianity answers the question best of how, Frankie Schaeffer said it, how then shall we live? How should humans be human?
Right.
But whatever tradition, whatever ideology, whatever philosophy we embrace, at the end of the day, our bottom line is that we will be born and we will die. And all of that time in between, we should be demonstrating the uniqueness of what it meant to be human.
Yeah, exactly. We had another friend said it's all about the dash, right? On your gravestone, you'll have your birth date and the day you died. It's all about the dash. What are we doing with our lives? And that's what we're really trying to explore and understand. I'm so grateful, Buster, for your insights here. Tell us a little bit more. I'm going to transition a little bit more. You had a chance to serve as the Secretary of State for the state of New Jersey. So you are, you're active in civil rights. You find faith. You are leading a church, and then you have this opportunity to have public service. Tell us a little bit about that experience and how that again helped inform or shape some of your beliefs?
It was the most interesting experience of my life. I had never been in government service. I had only worked in nonprofit and church. And I had been pastor of the church from which I recently retired for 10 years. And the governor called and said, I really need help running the state of New Jersey. What was interesting is at that time, we did not have a lieutenant governor position. We do now, in large measure because of the work we did. And our governor she was the first and only woman to serve as a governor. She grew up on a farm in rural New Jersey, and her family was very wealthy, which means that while she had integrity that was endorsed by the voters, thus making her governor, she didn't have a lot of experience with urban issues. She didn't have a lot of exposure to people from other cultures. She lived a rather sheltered life. And even as governor, while her passion was to be the governor for all people, she really needed help. And for her first term, her staff kept calling me because they knew about my work in community development. They knew about my background in civil rights and race relations. And so by her second term, she said, listen, we call you every week. Why don't you just come down to the State House and help me run the state? And I said no, because Doug, at that time we were completing the construction of our new sanctuary at the church. And I couldn't run down there and help the governor and leave the church wondering,
right, sure.
The sanctuary. So finally she kept the position open. It's an appointed position in New Jersey. She kept the position open for 9 months. Finally, she called my wife. And she said to my wife, Don, I need your husband down here in Trenton. And I came home from the church one day. My wife said, the governor called me today, and I like her. You need to go and help her. So the governor, she went around, and went to the power source. But I went
exactly.
There, and just to show you how interesting life became, a few days after I was sworn in as Secretary of State, that terrible violent shooting in Columbine happened, where all of those children got killed. And she turned to me and she said, this is not in your job description, but I know of your work with teenagers. I need you to put together an anti-violence strategy for the school kids in New Jersey. We do not want another Columbine. And we put together a statewide initiative, student-led, to prevent violence, victimization, and vandalism. And if you were to ask Governor Whitman today about my achieving anything when I was in office, she will mention that, even though it had nothing to do with the office of Secretary of State, but she trusted me to do projects like that. And I had a wonderful time of government service, continuing basically doing the same work that I normally did, but I just had a title and a driver.
That's right. And more work to do.
That's right.
And more work to do. So it's always something when God wants something done, he asks the busy person to do it, right? So you got a lot going on, but there you go. You've been able to see that perspective of government service and the role it plays in our community. And let me, we got maybe another, in the time we have here, help me connect a little bit the faith community, your patriotism, the race relations work you've done and the work you've done in government. How do those pieces, how should we think and our audience think about the roles that maybe those institutions play in our society and how they can work together? Because, as I'm listening, your role in government wasn't just an action of taking your position in government and doing work. It was because you had this history, because you were you and you had experience in these other areas that you were able to effectively do work that wasn't in your job description even. So help us understand how maybe some of these institutions can work together.
Well, when you have a position or an institution that controls resources, human resources, financial resources, facilities, in any kind of resources, I think the The question becomes, how do we leverage those resources to do the most good for people who need good done? In some instances, it's foster children. We did a lot of work in the foster care system, bringing churches and government together to recruit and train families for foster children. The government had the need, the church had the people. And so I think the collaborative question is, how do we identify the resources that we have? Sometimes we call them capabilities. What capabilities does corporate America have? What capabilities do churches have? What capabilities do individuals have? And then we make a list of needs. What are the needs? And by needs, I'm talking about how do we link those capabilities to areas in our country that could do much better if a collaboration did exist. And so it's what I do every day. I actually decided to build a company called Corporate Community Connections, where we take corporate leadership, corporate resources, corporate activities, and connect them with communities that could use access to those resources. And by the way, corporations that could use access to expanded markets. You look at it from a marketing standpoint. And it's just, I just enjoy it every day of my life. I look for opportunities to connect people, to connect resources, to connect institutions in a way that produce mutually beneficial outcomes.
Yeah.
And it's that mutual benefit that's the key. You see, when you're really committed to mutual benefit, it really negates the temptation to grab for power, because it's mutual benefit assumes that every activity and every relationship is win-win. And so even today, as I look at justice, Doug, that one of the raging issues in our nation is police and community relations. What I've done in the past is bring leadership from law enforcement and leadership from communities together to do two things. One, recognize we need each other. You cannot stop all of the crime in this country by law enforcement alone. Every police agency, every district attorney needs help from the community. Right. And likewise, communities cannot maintain civil order on their own. And since we have this mutual need, the question is, how best can we construct a partnership to provide the kind of quality in community living that we all deserve? And that partnership will produce justice. Now, there'll always be some people on either side, on the law enforcement side or the community side, that kind of violate the standards and the principles of a real partnership. And you take them somewhere and put them somewhere, but you don't throw away the baby with the bathwater.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So kind of in that theme, can you give us a couple examples? So what, as we talk about America and our history, our aspirations and our principles and ideals, yet the actions that where we've missed it, where we've not lived up to those ideals, but we've self-corrected. What does progress look like to you today? What are some examples that you've seen? You maybe mentioned a couple. Maybe you could dive a little deeper or add a couple to it. What have you seen where we should look around and say, and say, okay, hey, there is progress being made. There are some, success stories, in communities around our country. So it's worth it for us to dive in and work together even harder going forward. Help us understand that from your perspective.
Sure. One of the disadvantages we have, Doug, is that mainstream media that really has the majority of the attention don't really find these kinds of stories meaningful. And so they go virtually unnoticed. But there are communities like Las Vegas, Nevada, like Dallas, Texas, where communities, and often led by former criminals, are forming partnership with the police so that communities and police can work together all over the country. Baltimore, Maryland, New York, Queens, New York. I could take you to 50 communities tomorrow where people, some of whom are former criminals, I'm telling you, come out of jail and they decide to bring healing to the same communities where they wreak havoc, and they work hand in hand with the very police that incarcerated them.
Wow.
This is happening. What's happening around the country is that more and more financial institutions are making capital available for Black-owned businesses and women who otherwise found it difficult to access capital. I formed a partnership that I announced last month with a company out of California, and they pledged $220 million to people in our organization and people that follow us to buy, fix up, and sell houses.
Right.
And not one news organization was willing to write that. Now, if I had done an announcement that $220 million was denied Black people by some white racists, I'd have been on 60 Minutes, you see?
Sure, yeah.
And I'm telling you, the news media is doing this country a disservice. And I'm talking about all of the news media, because they have the microphones, they have the platforms, and if they would tell more good news, then good news would spread and grow. So we have economic gaps being filled. We have a historic inclusion on boards of directors. I'm on the board of a multi-million-dollar mortgage servicing company. There's 7 directors, 2 are women, 2 are Black. Out of 7 people, we're a majority minority board in a company that has over 1 million customers. So what I'm telling you is that there is as much good news, if not more, than there is bad news. And that's why we need guys like you and podcasts like Believe to help people understand that this is not a time to give up. This is a time to do exactly what we're talking about. You don't create success by studying failure alone. You create success by finding successes, examples of successes. You make them best practices. You extract the principles so they can be spread, and then you tell the story and teach the strategy. That's how you win. Your company was not built on failure. Your company was built on, look, Mrs. Smith was able to be successful, and let's show you what she did. Let's train you in that method. You apply it to where you are, and you can build your business the way she built her business.
Exactly right. And the idea that so many people are out there doing good things. And Buster, maybe we just kind of close with, tell us a little bit about some of the good things that you're doing, because you mentioned, we talked recently that you're retiring, and I knew as soon as you said, I said, there's no way Buster's going to retire from anything ever. You may be transitioning to different type of work, and you're doing that. But tell us a little bit about, you're on these boards. You're doing some other activities as well, I know. So tell us a little bit about that, and that can help us maybe think through, all the audience here, what can we do? How do we study success by following Buster, by doing what you're doing, and in our own way, in our own community, with our own capacity, with our own interest, but thinking about our neighbors. Maybe give us a little idea as we kind of wrap things up here.
Well, Doug, God has blessed me to have more, do more, and know more than I ever dreamt. But it's always been through some individual that has reached out to help me. Always. The governor called me. I didn't campaign to be Secretary of State. The governor called me. I'm on this corporate board. A lawyer called the CEO and said, you need this guy on your board. And so what I've tried to do with my life is to take the blessings that I've received and the successes that I've had and create some institutional structures that can take that to scale, so that it's not just Buster Soaries knowing Doug DeVos, but it's Buster Soaries and the network that I can build, connecting with Doug DeVos and the network that he has to create opportunities that neither you nor I have to touch physically. Right. And so, for instance, all of the data all of the data indicates that Black Americans are less likely to speak to a financial professional than the general population. We generally get our financial advice from the barbers and the beauty shops. And so knowing that, and Prudential is one of the great financial companies of the world, they're right here in New Jersey. I have a relationship with Prudential where when we have events with churches, we have online events, we ask people to please let us introduce you to a financial professional who will give you a consultation for free. And Prudential provides those financial professionals. And so we've got thousands of people every month that are connecting for the first time in their lives with a financial professional to put together a budget, a retirement plan. How much money do I have to save if I'm 45 and want to retire at 70? So this is the work that we do every day of our lives. I mentioned the access to capital for buying and fixing up and selling homes. What I'm trying to do is really aim at the weakest spots in Black America, because Black America has this racial wealth gap where we are further behind for obvious reasons than any other ethnic group. And so whether it's building your credit or whether it's accessing capital, whether it's becoming first-time home buyers, what I've done is take my civil rights background and my national contacts and my church base and just spread the word. There are opportunities out here, and let us connect you to those opportunities. So that's really that's my lifestyle. That's my mantra. That's my work. And it shows up in various ways. I have a for-profit company. I have a nonprofit foundation, and it's fun. I just love getting email from people and messages online telling me that they met with a professional or they accessed an opportunity, and they can't thank me enough.
Oh, well, Buster, so your activity, you are turning your beliefs into behaviors. You are acting on the beliefs that you have, and you're impacting so many in your community and beyond, as you said, but building networks and building relationships, building win-win connections that are an inspiration for all of us. And to follow your lead, when we have a call, respond. They may have to go through our spouse to get there, but but to respond and to be available, and to make the connections that we can make. Maybe we can't as an individual fix everything, but if we have a connection, let's make the connection that we can. Reach out to people who are hurting, and believe in them enough that they can help themselves, but they just might need a little hand, a start. One connection that they can take and move forward from there. So Buster, I'm just grateful for these conversations. Anything else that I missed that you want to share with our audience as we kind of wrap things up here, my friend?
Well, I've decided also, Doug, that it's important to write some of this stuff down. For years, I was insecure about my writing. And another reason I appreciate, of course, your family is that through indirect contacts, I ended up meeting the people at Zondervan in Grand Rapids. And Zondervan published my first book. Of course, David Cook published another book, but Zondervan got me started as an author. So I have a lot to thank God for, coming from Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I've got 9 books now, and they're available on Amazon.com, of course. And anyone who really wants deeper insights, anyone who wants deeper insights into my strategy or my history, I'm pretty transparent in my writing, and those books are available. And I'll continue to write, because I do believe that an old Jamaican friend of mine said, a drop of ink can make a million think. And so I think we have to use all of these media that we now have access to spread good news and to help people look for examples of things they can do. You asked the question, what can people do? I find that most people would like to do something if they had a suggestion that was manageable, that was affordable, and that was useful. And everyone I've ever met, like yourself, has had some interest in answering that question, what can I do? And I think if we can build around that answer, we would have less anxiety, we'd have more justice, and we would experience as a nation greater freedom.
Amen. My friend, thank you. Thank you so much, Buster. I'm just so grateful for what you do, who you are, and for your willingness to share, whether it's written down in your books, but for taking your time here to share with us, and the encouragement for us to express our beliefs and to be engaged in our community in whatever way that we can. As you said, it was manageable, affordable, and useful.
Right.
You don't want to spend time and not be useful. So
That's
we want
right.
we want to be useful in our communities and our neighborhoods. So Buster Soaries, thank you for your time. Thank you for your friendship. Thank you for your leadership and all that you're doing. And thanks for spending a little time with us here on Believe.
Thank you, Doug. God bless you.
You, God bless you too. So that's it for this episode of Believe. Thank you again to Dr. Buster Soaries for joining us, and thank you for joining us. And we'll look forward to seeing you all soon. Thanks, everyone.